Good morning, Commissioner, Participants Council, Mr. Lee. If I could ask the court reporter to affirm Mr. Lee, please.
Sir, do you affirm the evidence you're about to give in this matter with the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Mr. Lee?
Mr. Lee, I think your mute is on.
I do.
Okay, thank you. Please proceed, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Lee. Thank you for coming.
Good morning.
Just to start off, I'd just like to go briefly through your educational and work background at the MTO. So I understand that you have been employed by the MTO since June 1st, 2009 and are still there. Is that correct?
Correct.
And in terms of your education, you have a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering and a Master's in Geotechnical Engineering from the University of Ottawa. Is that right?
Correct.
And do you recall when you obtained those degrees?
I believe the bachelor is 1982 and the master is 1988.
Okay. And you're a practicing engineer and a member of the PEO, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And what were you doing right before you joined the MTO? What was your last job?
Before I joined the ministry itself, my last career was that I actually started a number of firms that do carbon aggregation business itself in terms of creating carbon credits.
I see. Okay. And then at the MTO itself, I just want to go through your positions since you joined in June 2009. I understand that first you were the head of the Central Region Geotechnical Engineering.
Correct.
And that was from when you started in June 1st, 2009 to January 22nd, 2012. Is that right?
Correct.
And then you were became the acting head of the Merrow Bituminous section.
Correct.
And that was from January 23rd, 2012 to October 1, 2012.
Correct.
Okay. So just about 9 months, not that long as acting head.
Correct.
Okay. And then you became the head of the Merrow Pavements and Foundations section.
Correct.
And that was from October 1, 2012 to July 1st, 2019. Is that right?
Correct.
And then for a short period of time, you were the acting head of Merrow Bituminous again. Is that right?
Correct.
And that was July 2nd, 2019 to October 4th, 2019.
Correct.
And since then, you moved back to be the head of Merrow Pavements and Foundations. Is that right?
Head of pavement because there's a reorganization.
Right. And is it now called the EMO Engineering Materials Office Pavements section? Is that
Correct.
what it's called now? Okay.
Correct.
Right. But it's the continuation of the same role, but with pavements.
Pavement, correct.
Okay. So with the exception of the period from July to the beginning of October 2019, when you were the acting head in Bituminous, you've been the head of Merrow Pavements
Correct.
with the change since October 1, 2012, right?
Correct.
Okay. And am I correct that when you started in October 1, 2012 as the head of Pavements and Foundations, that you replaced Betty Bennett?
Correct.
And she'd been in that role for a short period after replacing Becca Lane. Is that right?
Correct.
And then I guess that once that you reported to Becca Lane when she became manager of Miro in April 2013.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, and could you just briefly describe your role as the head of pavements and foundations, as it was?
I guess the role of pavement and foundation, there's 3 subunits within the pavement group. One group is basically doing pavement data collection for the ministry in terms of pavement condition. The other group itself is pavement management system group, whereby we actually take the data from pavement condition data and actually implement it into a pavement management system to make decision of budget and pavement rehab requirement of the ministry. The third group that basically I deal with in pavement group is actually the pavement engineering group, whereby we look at all the new technologies, specification, materials, or technologies that can be used to enhance the ministry construction and specification or standard or policies.
Okay.
So on the pavement section, we actually act as the headquarters for the regional geotech, where they do the pavement design, pavement rehab. We basically help them to develop specification, standard, and policies, and ensure a provincial consistency in basically applying the specification, standard, and policies.
And under that role, part of it is the operator of the MTO's locked wheel skid tester. Is that right?
Correct. That is under the pavement condition data collection group.
Okay. And so once you became the head of pavements and foundations, Frank Marciello then reported to you until he left in early 2015. Is that right?
Correct. Correct.
And he was, as we understand it, he was until his departure, he was the sole operator of the locked wheel skid tester. Is that right?
Correct.
And we've heard that requests for testing for skid testing using the locked wheel skid trailer could come from a variety of sources.
Correct.
Right. So from the regions, for example.
Yeah, that would, I would say, would be the two primary source of requests. One is from the region. The other one would be from the designated source list, where the ministry used that test protocol to put material that can be accepted for construction on ministry highway for our use.
Right. Sorry, the second one being the request from the soils and aggregates section for DSM
Correct.
Purposes.
Yeah. Correct.
Okay. And then the first from the regions, typically those are, as I understand it, when there's a request when they've apprehended that there may be an issue with a stretch of highway, identified a potential problem, and arising from that, they want skid testing done to see what the friction is on that area of highway. Is that right?
Correct.
And then as well also from geotechnical offices. For some
Correct. The geotechnical office generally are the channel through where the region would actually request the testing itself, because generally, as I said, as the pavement function itself, we are the headquarters for the regional geotech. The regional office have their 5 regions have their offices, but we actually liaise and actually look at how we will do things consistently through at the provincial level through basically either GeoCom or the pavement section, I guess, advisory and technical provide technical support to the regional geotech offices.
Okay, and you referred to GeoCom, that's the Geotechnical Committee?
Correct. Whereby all the head of the 5 regions sits in, so does a few of the Murrow head, and definitely the pavement section that generally chairs the meeting.
And I understand there's also occasionally, less frequently, there's external requests, for example, from police forces. Is that right?
Correct. Sometimes from police, sometimes from area municipality, occasionally.
And we've heard quite a bit of evidence about the MTO's use of the friction number 30 and other numbers in evaluating skid resistance of pavement. But I'd like to get your perspective on that. If you could describe how you would describe the use of the FN30 number within the MTO and particularly within your area.
Okay, I guess with some of the knowledge after being engaged in a number of years in this discussion with various group itself on application of friction, and in having gone through the request of actually looking at writing a performance-based specification, looking at friction number. Friction number itself is actually a single number itself is challenging because there are a lot of factors that actually get engaged when you look at friction itself, because the speed, for example, speed of vehicle have a contribution. The state of your tire, is it ball or is it fully treaded, have an implication. The geometry of the site itself has...
Sorry, before you get to me, I didn't quite catch what you said after the speed of the vehicle, and then you said the state of, I think.
The condition of your tire have a
okay.
huge impact on the friction number. Is it basically ball? Is your tire with full tread or is it ball? And geometry of the site itself plays an important factor itself. Are you on a super elevated section? All this thing actually plays into a part. And even if that section is it prone to icing up prematurely, and all these things actually have to be taken into consideration when you look at friction. So in some sense, as a guide itself, we initially look at the friction number threshold, but then for further determination, we generally want to take a look at additional factors itself, even on mix. How is the mix on that section placed? What is the aggregate composition of the mix and the gradation of the mix itself, the texture of the surface? So in that sense, if you want me to judge friction itself now, I would generally look at all those other contributing factors before I can make a holistic decision on what is the final action for that particular section, and it's actually site specific.
Right. Okay. And so I think you referred to the particular number of 30 that it's a guide, and then that but it is a number, and then there's all the other factors that you're going to want to look at before a decision is made about whether an intervention of some sort needs to take place or not. Is that fair?
And yeah, and likely we break it down to up to a certain range. We will look at the additional factor to make decision of further monitoring and continued monitoring. And does that number fall way below a certain critical number that has been established in some state jurisdiction that we would consider the definitive, some action should take place in relatively reasonable time?
Sorry, and what number are you talking about there?
If it is tested at FN 65 kilometer an hour, the number have to drop below 25.
Okay, at FN 65.
Correct.
And sorry, just then to back up, you're saying if it drops below FN 25 tested at 65 kilometers an hour, then if I've understood you correctly, then you're much more strongly going to look at an intervention at that point. Correct. But higher than that, but over 25 and over, I guess, to I suppose 30, you are that's when you are looking at all of the factors that you just described. Is that right? Correct. And see what additional measure or monitoring required, depending on all those factors in combination. Okay. And in between, the 25 and 30, as you described it, arising out of those kind of the investigations. One of the things that you might do is simply have further monitoring, further friction testing.
Correct. Continuing friction testing to see how the behavior further down the road itself, in terms of is the number decreasing, how fast it's decreasing, and all those things may be used as a factor for further decision.
Like how it changes over time.
Correct.
Okay. And in addition to the other things that you were looking at, that you described. Correct. Okay.
Because in terms of the testing itself, there is also a need to recognize that each and every time we go out and test the section, we may be testing not exact same spot. We might be testing few inch away from the previous time you test. So there's an expectation that even if you go back and test in following year, there are certain variability because of the location you test now have changed a little bit, and you will have to apply statistical filtering in order for you to come up with some conclusion on the data itself.
Right. And so any particular result, as I understand it, because the locked wheel tester is the brake is applied periodically over every so often, whether it's 100 meters, 250 meters, whatever the distance is, that and then the brake is applied for typically 4 seconds. I understand that you're not necessarily getting, even if you're trying to, you're not necessarily getting the testing done on exactly the same spot.
Correct.
And so you could end up, even though you're testing the same pavement, apart from changes to, temperature changes and otherwise about weather and the time of the year and so forth, you have that potential variable as well.
Correct.
And then you talked about FN 65, that if it drops below 25 at FN 65. I appreciate that is the ASTM standard test speed.
Correct.
But I also understand that the MTO typically tests at the posted speed, not at the ASTM speed. So how do you make that decision?
So that's the reason why when we did the network testing in 2013, we purposely actually test a lot of those locations at posted speed, but we also test it at 65 kilometers an hour and actually try to develop the relationship of when you test it at 100 kilometers, when I want to normalize the result at 65 kilometers an hour, what is the friction number at 65 kilometers an hour? The reason for that is because a lot, other than the ASTM standard, a lot of research has been done in the state where the decision of when the number below FN 25 at 65 kilometers an hour is when some of those agencies analyze their data, they notice that is when there is increase in accident rate, noticeable increase in accident rate when the number goes to below 25 at tested at 65 kilometers an hour using the locked wheel test method.
Okay. And we will talk about the 2013 network testing, but what's the difference that you use between arising out of that? What's the difference that you came to between FN 65 and FN 100?
There is an equation that we developed is a quadratic equation, to the power 2 rule equation that we come up with based on the testing, the number of sampling sites that we have. So there is an equation that we now have for test speed of 600 kilometers hour if we want to now project, normalize it back to FN 65. And that basically is some of, for internal reporting, that actually is a standard that we report within pavement section, because I actually use that number because the scale that I use to judge the FN 30 is actually based on the 65 kilometer ASTM research done at the state, and between 30 to 25 is actually based on FN 65. So at posted speed, there is none of those testing done to set those scale itself. So as a guide, that is how we actually will will provide guidance to regional geotech is to normalize it to a scale that basically have data to back it at research done at the US like Caltrans and Florida DOT and Northwestern itself.
Understood, but there's the equation, but if you have a number tested at 100, how do you convert, what is the conversion? Like if you have FN 40, what's the conversion? How much higher is it at FN 65?
FN, as I said, it is strictly based on a calibration curve that we have developed, and it have to be, and we are actually still doing further work as we speak and everything to see, is that calibration curve strictly for good enough for all pavement type combined together in terms of all the different surface costs that the ministry use, or do I actually even need to separate it, whereby 12.5 SC2 is a different calibration correction, and if it is SMA, is it a different correction, and if it is other mix type that we use, the predominant mix type we use, should it be different correction? We do not have data yet. We only have one whereby we combine everything together. So that is the one that we are using right now. The standard calibration equation that we have used is based on all combined surface type. But from where I'm sitting, we still need to do additional work and likely more testing itself to see, do I need to separate it for different mix type itself, because the texture of different mix itself is different, and I have a suspicion we may require different correlation equation if we use different mix type.
Okay, and that's fair, and I understand completely. You're saying that it's aggregated at the moment, so to speak, yeah. But of all the mixed type. But what's the? I mean, does the differential change? I'll just say if the difference is 10, normally is that different at depending on what the FN 100 number is? Is the difference between FN 100 and FN 65? Does it vary depending on what the actual obtained result is, or is it a constant difference of, and I'll toss it out there.
It depends on the result of the FN you obtain at the posted speed. The correction will actually, because the correction is, as I said, is to the power of 2 itself. So in that sense, it's not a linear correction. It's actually a power correction.
Okay. All right, but do you know, for example, if you have an FN, at FN 100, if your result is 35, what is that at FN 65? Do you know?
I won't second guess it, because as I said, you will need to look at what is that number and the speed and then basically do the correction, and likely it's going to be at least 10 to 15, likely higher.
The difference could be 10 or 15 friction numbers?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're saying that an FN at FN 100 of 35 could be FN 50 at
40 something, 50
65?
at FN 65, correct.
Sorry, did you say 40 or 45 or 50?
45 to 50 range would not be surprising.
Okay, but you can't say for sure either, is that right?
I'm saying I would basically have to apply those equations that we developed to get that definitive number for you.
Okay.
Given that we have done quite a lot of work to come up with that correlation, we would need to use that equation.
And when you're looking at the test results, and you're interpreting the test results that come in from, we'll use a request from a region, for example, and you've described your approach to it. is your approach to it something that you share with the regional, usually the geotechnical people?
For regional, yes. The reason is because we are actually supposed to provide assistance to them to ensure consistency of how they implement the specification, standard, and policy. So in that sense, if it's the MTO regional office that have the challenges as pavement section, we will provide them with the technical assistance. But if it is a DSM aggregate testing, the responsibility falls to the soil and aggregate section to interpret the result, because we then just basically provide the testing services. The answer will be provided to the soil and aggregate section. They are the one that will have to make the decision of what to provide in technical judgment.
Right. Nonetheless, you would still consult with them on occasion in soils and aggregates about your views of the test results, or no?
Not if we are dealing with regional geotech. Basically, it is the pavement section responsibility. But overall, sometimes we do discuss with soil and aggregate, because some of this issue cross both section itself, and then we will try to see can we come to some consensus on some of the direction that we go with some of this into our policy.
And when you're looking at results from the skid trailer, is it the average FN? I mean, we've seen the way the results are spat out, and it shows the average, the minimum, the maximum, and it shows the individual results. So is it the average or individual results, or a combination of both?
It's actually the average, is because the ASTM standard and interpretation is actually based on the average. So a lot of times we actually will look at the average. But if we start to look at it as performance-based specification, we then start to look at the average, but then we filter in on top of it some statistical requirement to basically develop the performance-based specification. So that's the only difference, is that if it is for performance-based specification, there's a statistical component that overlay on top of the average friction trailer result.
Okay, and just we will talk about the performance-based specification, but you're talking about performance contracts that have warranties in them, or minimum oversight contracts, those sorts of things where there's an actual friction number specified in the contract that is to be maintained.
Correct.
That's the context you're talking about. Okay, but if it's not that,
then the average result generally is what we will look at. And as I said, with the regional geotech, the discussion would be based on the average result rather than the high-low, because ultimately one of the background filter that we do is that we will at the pavement section, we will analyze all those results for that set of data. Is it normally distributed? If it is considered normally distributed, we would consider that, the result are within a certain statistical inference, because ultimately you have to look at the result itself. Is it statistically normal? If it is not, then there's a different implication when you analyze the result.
Okay, so there's a few things in there to unpack. One thing though is, I appreciate you're not just looking at the minimum or the maximum. I get that, but I would have thought that as well, you would be, if individual results, for example, are strung together, if there's regardless if the average is well over 30 or 40 for that matter, if you had a number of consecutive results, for example, that were concerning, whatever that number is, below 30, well below 30, extremely below 30, that could also be something that would get your attention?
As I said, we do a statistical analysis of all those data points, and if the result falls onto a normal distributed, even if you have low numbers or number of low number, it's still considered within the testing requirement of that normal distributed answer of the mean itself. So then what it implies, that mean still apply. If the data fail what we call the normal distribution test based on when we analyze the data, we look at the kurtosis and the skewness of the data itself. If that test fails, it implies your data is distinctly not normally distributed. Then additional looking at the data is required to see, do we need to separate the data set itself? But a lot of the time when we look at it, generally the data fall into a normal distribution, which means based on the testing variance, even the testing variance, the mean result is still representative of all those low results itself. Because when you do testing, sometimes, as I said, there is certain variation. Basically, some of it is due to the equipment, sometimes it's due to the location. And if you analyze the data set is considered normally distributed, it implies it is within the testing norm. That set of data is considered one family of curve. If it's one family of curve, it implies the average result is representative of all those data. So that is one analysis. At the pavement side, we do it without even letting the region know, but we actually check for the normal distribution of those test data set within the average result. And if it passes that test, it implies that average is representative.
Okay. So if it passed that test as you described it, do I understand you correctly as saying if you had 3 consecutive results at 25, but that was within the normal distribution, as you've called it, that you would I don't know if the right word is discount those results and not have a concern about it? Do I understand that correctly?
The judgment will be based on the average result itself to come up with your decision. As I said, depending on where that number falls, do you basically look at the additional factors or not? Unless, as I said, if FN65 normalized to FN65, it drops below the 25 level, then highly likely we would recommend the region look at some immediate or relatively short-term remedial action to mitigate the challenges that you have.
Okay. And when did you start doing the normalization to FN65?
It's after we did the network testing program, because prior to that itself, we do not look at data to do that jump itself, and strictly it's based on looking at FN at whatever posted speed. That has been the policy prior to my time, and that has continued until we actually have the network testing, because the network testing gives us a much better feel of what is the friction number in the ministry network itself, because without that, we could not even break down. And even with the 2013 network testing, there are gaps, because in a certain pavement type, if you only have few data points, the few data point may not be sufficient for you to make a very strong statistical inference of what is the answer is. And those are the ones that we basically continue to program into our friction testing to get more of those in order for us to close some of the gaps.
Okay. And so the network testing in 2013 itself, you started in your role as head of pavements and foundations October 1st, 2012, and then the testing, of course, happened in 2013. Was the network testing already in the works before you arrived, or was that your initiative?
It's after I arrived, and because at that point,
I mean, after you arrived in the new role in October 1st, 2012. So
the network testing was triggered by the requirement when I was asked by a steering committee to actually look at developing performance-based specification for the ministry. And one of the metrics that we were asked to pin down was friction number itself. We were asked to basically look at, if we go into performance-based specification, other than all the cracking, right, and everything, one of the parameters we were asked to look at getting a criteria for is friction number. And that basically triggered my initiation of basically doing some network testing, because we did not have a network friction number where we can actually try to use it as a criteria.
Right. So if you're going to stipulate a number, you need to, in contracts, the idea is you needed to have better data in order to understand what the appropriate number was. Is that fair?
Right, because there is, in developing the performance-based specification, the ministry have made a commitment to the industry where we will set we will actually set the performance-based specification at performance level of what is already in existence based on the old contract itself. So we are not going to set a number that is above and beyond what the normal achievement of the value by the contractor, because that implies some contractor will never meet it. So the contracting industry want assurance from the ministry, if we are going to go to a radically new specification strictly based on performance where the industry don't have any of those data, that we are setting the standard whereby based on existing testing of the network of how they have constructed some of the highway itself, it is a value that basically still can be achieved by the contracting industry.
Right. And sorry, at the outset of that answer, you referred to a commitment. Was that a commitment to industry, to the industry?
That was a commitment by our management to industry that we would set the performance metric to what is, based on what it has been constructed before under the old type of specification.
And so then I understand that you directed Mr. Marciello to conduct the network testing in 2013. Is that right?
Correct.
And how approximately how many were actually tested? I think there were 194 identified, the highway sections.
194 site was identified, and probably 1,000 something section itself has been tested. More than 1,000 for sure.
Sorry, in the 2013 testing?
Correct, because the testing initially went through the summer and we start to analyze some of the result, and then basically we noticed that it's still not total set, and we continue to test on until the onset of winter itself that year.
Sorry, I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. When you say 194 highway sections were identified, and that I think you said more than 1,000 were done. How did Mr. Marciello do more than 1,000 sections?
Because we actually take if it is 194 section, we can actually book the major section into smaller section itself. Okay. Or if we do lane 1, then do lane 2 and lane 3. Each lane actually have slightly different result, because we actually try to book enough statistical point in order for us to analyze the different combination of factors itself, because of mixed type, speed, and all the different combination like concrete pavement versus asphalt pavement. So in that sense, there's a huge number of combination, and if you just use only 194 site but not break it down into different segments, you would not have enough data points.
Okay, so I think I understand you. You weren't saying that started at 194 and then it expanded by 5 times. You're saying that those 194 were hived off into smaller.
Correct.
I can put it that
way. Correct.
Okay. All right. And if we could go to overview document 4, images 137 and 135, please. Sorry, 137 and 138. I think I misspoke. And these 2 pages, and we have this thing that we call the overview document, whereby various facts and documents are put into evidence. I'll take you to some of the actual underlying documents as well, but if I'm taking you the overview document and you want to look at the underlying document, please let me know that it's not giving you enough information. So in paragraph 327, it indicates, as we just discussed, that by March 2013, the MTO identified 194 sections to be tested using the MTO's brake force trailer. And there were initial concerns about the resources available to complete the network testing internally. But then Mr. Marciello was assigned to complete it. Is that fair? There was a concern about whether he could complete it all?
Yes, there is, and because of this itself, we actually, did something, we actually let him work overtime, which is something that we generally do not allow.
Right. And there is, in paragraph 328, I'm not sure if that reference is entirely correct. Do you know when it refers to the completed, the network testing being completed in the summer of 2013? Do you recall when it was completed?
I would think that it's actually at near to onset of winter of 2013 rather than summer. At summer, Frank have completed some testing itself and we start the analysis process, but I don't believe that's the complete set of data.
Okay.
There was additional testing done after the summer itself where we get additional data to analyze the overall network data itself. Because as I say, even as we speak right now, based on some of the gap identified, we are still continuing to do additional testing.
And if we look at paragraph 331, this is before the network testing took place. On January 11, 2013, Mr. Marciello emailed you attaching a presentation with graphs comparing historical pavement friction performance over time of SMA, dense friction course, HL1 and HL3 surface courses, and there's a comparison of the four. So this is before the network testing.
Correct.
Do you recall this?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And what does this show?
Well, it indicated the SMA friction number.
Sorry, we can expand this. It's a little bit blurry. Sorry, I apologize. Might be a little better.
Yeah, based on this sampling itself, it indicates SMA basically friction number tends to be comparable to HL3, which is something that basically I've commented itself, whereby I think maybe the sampling size might be too small for SMA. Because SMA at this point in time, we already knew that SMA have initial frictional challenges. And when you test the SMA itself have a huge impact on the FN number that you are going to report. If you test the friction number of SMA very early in the SMA life, you are going to get a lower number compared to if you test it 1 or 2 years out itself, you will get a different number. So in that sense, some of those things are not totally known to me, and some of these are still questions that I still have.
Right. Okay. And as I'm understanding this chart, though, it's showing for all of the four listed surface courses, the FN friction numbers on the y-axis, and then it's the age. The age is on the x-axis, so it's showing over time what the average FN is for the sections that are part of the sample, right?
Correct.
Okay, so, and I appreciate we've heard a lot about the early age SMA low friction issue, but presumably that's not something that's applying for, once you're past year one there, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right, and then we could go to images 181 and 182. And paragraph 434, which starts on the left-hand image and continues on the right. This is a full excerpt of notes from a meeting on December 16, 2013, indicating at the ORBA and OMPA's request on that date, the MTO presented Mr. Brown, that's Sandy Brown of OMPA, with friction data collected from 110 sections across the province from 400 series highways and 2-lane highways, with various mix types, including SP12.5, SP12.5 SC1, and FC2, and SMA. And Kevin English had notes from that meeting, and that's what's referred to there. And am I correct then? This is after the completion of the network testing in 2013. Is that right?
This is substantially into the network testing already, correct?
Well, it's December, so you're not still doing the network testing at that point, I take it.
Because it takes time to process some of the data, because it is 110 section, I likely think that we have slightly more than 110 sections, so maybe a few additional sections may or may not be included in yet.
Right. Okay, no, I was just distinguishing, but I understand that point. I was just making sure I understood that the testing itself was done.
Yes, the testing likely has been completed, but had all the sections been processed yet? At this point, when we present 110 section itself, is something that I would think that maybe there's a few more sections available.
Okay. And in the third paragraph there, yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry, you were at this meeting. You're listed on the attendees. Should have.
Correct.
Yeah. And you recall the meeting?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And just in this paragraph, it indicates the MTO has not determined if we will be going with one friction number for all highways or friction numbers for different classifications of highway types, i.e. one friction number for 400 series highways and one for 2-lane highways. MTO will wait until the analysis is complete before the details are worked out. And so do I understand this correctly, that the contemplation was potentially, as the first part is one number, which is going to be the requirement in contracts, in the performance contracts, one friction number, or to have differing friction number requirements in performance contracts for depending on the classification of the highway. Is that right?
Correct. Because until we get a full data analysis of all the different highway classification and basically look at the data itself, we may change our mind based on the data if we see a significant difference in performance at 400 series highway versus 2-lane highway, because the traffic volume on 400 series highway generally is much higher than some of the 2-lane highway, and basically the tire pavement interaction, because of the higher volume, it may have different wear and tear, and the friction number generation might be different based on the different class of highway. We do not know at that point in time, because those analyses were never done by the ministry before.
So is that based on the, would that difference, that distinction be based on the friction demand or on the?
It's also based on the wear and tear, because if you have 400,000 ADT on your highway, the amount of tear that mix get versus one that have 500 trucks, 500 vehicle a day is going to be very different. And would that change the friction performance of highway because of strictly the sheer volume of vehicle? We don't have those data. Is why we are saying that we need to look at, when we analyze those different highway and mix type and everything, would we see a different trend? Those are the things that we can't tell until we analyze the network data. And if we don't have those data, likely we will have to augment and supplement and obtain those data before we make those decisions.
Okay. And am I correct? This is in relation to the performance contract issue, not in relation to the more generalized analysis of friction numbers. Is that right? Like,
correct.
Yeah. Okay. You get a request from a region and so forth.
Correct.
Okay. And if you could take that down, and then there's a reference at the bottom. Yep, that's right. And it goes on to the next page that MTO is currently not considering. Actually, sorry, take that down for a moment. Apologize. It's the paragraph above, and then and that one as well, where it starts. Sandy asked. So this is again Sandy Brown from AMPA indicating that he's asking whether the MTO has considered other ways of collecting friction data, and he's talks about wondering if the friction trailer is the right tool considering the changes to motor vehicles, i.e. anti-lock brakes. And then, according to the minutes, he raises the issue of the grip tester, and which is used for by Transport Canada and others for measuring runway friction. He raises the cost issue and so forth. And I take it as, first of all, he's raising here, it's expensive to get to buy a skid trailer. The grip tester is less expensive, and if contractors need to purchase this in order to monitor friction under performance contracts, the cost is a concern. Is that what he's raising here in part?
Yes, I think that's what he raised.
Okay. And then it says MTO is currently not considering using a grip tester, but is considering the ARAN to collect macro and micro texture measurements as another way to determine friction. So on do you recall that discussion about the grip tester?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And what was the basis for the if you recall, for the response about not considering using the grip tester currently?
The reason is because based on our research of the friction number and testing itself, the skid tester that we use, at least it's actually, there's an ASTM standard. At that point in time, if you look at the grip tester, there is no ASTM or Astro test method that backs up the result from grip tester. And based on a lot of the research done to look at, is the grip tester result, can it be correlated to the ASTM brake force trailer? The answer is no, it's not. So if the result cannot be correlated to the ASTM brake force trailer, as a testing agency for the ministry, I prefer to use a test method that basically, if anything is challenged, is actually based on an ASTM standard. And there are certain guide of what those number is based on FN65 array developed by State Dot itself. So in that sense, at least there's sufficient information of how to manage friction number if you want to manage it. There are already published standard and specification out there itself. Whereas the grip tester, as I said, at that point when we were researching it, those kind of documentation was not available to us. And that's the reason why our preference is to stick with the ASTM brake force trailer. But we are also starting to use our ARAN equipment to look at macro texture and supplement the ASTM FN number to actually generate what we call the IFI number itself, is the International Friction Index. But that exercise, the limited amount we do, also proved to be a challenge.
Okay. And presumably, in addition to what you described, given that the history, the MTO had a long history of testing using the locked wheel tester, there could be issues with continuity of data. When you refer to the correlation problem, you would have a problem correlating data using the different device to the reams of data that the MTO had historically. Is that fair?
Correct.
Okay, if we could go to take that down, please. And if we could go to images 151 and 152. And paragraphs 365 and 366 are referring to a slide deck from a meeting with the ORBA on March 4th, 2014, titled MTO Network Friction Analysis, which includes slides comparing friction numbers and age of the pavement compared by surface type, including SMA, but the other surface types as well. Do you recall that? Well, we can go to it, and I will go to it. Do you recall this meeting and the presentation?
Yes, I think I do.
Okay, so if we could go to MTO 14811, please. And did you present it, or?
I believe I did.
Okay. Yeah, there's the email referred to, I won't go to it, does it indicate Stephen Lee presented the attached presentation to the group. So, okay. All right, so it's titled MTO Network Friction Analysis, presented to the ORB Hot Mix Committee, March 4th, 2014. And if we could go to the next image. And the one after that, image 3. Sort of in the introduction, and it refers in the third sentence to in 2013, friction testing expanded to include over 150 pavement sections as part of a network level study. So that's what we were just talking about, the network testing in 2013?
Correct.
Okay. And as you've indicated, it conducted the testing at 65 and 100 kilometers per hour. And then there's other things that you talked about the macro texture data and the assessed friction number and IFI as pavement performance parameters. And then the third bullet says conduct a rudimentary analysis of friction results based on pavement types, pavement age, mix types, and traffic level. And I'm gonna take you to some of those slides, but when you say rudimentary, you're just referring to, look, this is all very preliminary and so forth. What are you getting at there?
Yeah, I guess because this is the first time we analyze it, and I'm not sure whether the data set is as complete as we want. So in that sense, I'm saying it's like it is not likely going to be the complete set, because based on any of the gap itself, we know we will actually committed to go back and do more data collection as required.
Okay.
If we see gaps.
And then the next image. And talking about data analysis, and I think you've described to some extent that it's in that first bullet that it's represents a cross section of flexible and rigid pavements. So on the flexible side of things, I think I understand those are asphalt pavements, but the rigid pavements, is that concrete pavements as well?
Correct.
Okay. And then the pavement age based on MTO contract records. So you're looking back at, again, so what's the age of each particular section that you're testing? Because you're looking at it over time, right?
Correct.
Next image 5, I think. And this slide is titled FN versus age, all surface type. And it's not in color here, unfortunately, but on the y-axis, we've got the friction number and then the pavement age on the x-axis. I can see that. And I also see, though, that some of these types. Each line or symbol is one of the pavement types listed on the right-hand side, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and some of them are just one point in one age in time. Like I see for HL1 is the top one listed. It's got a square, and then it has one square at 8 years. Does that mean that there was just one HL1 sample?
Correct. And I guess one of the things that to take away from this is that we are actually combine pavement segment with different age, but not monitored to what I call a time series monitoring, which is a much more accurate way of monitoring a pavement section. I'm saying that if you are HL1, some of the segment that was done 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, but these are radically different pavement segment, although the same surface type. I did not actually plot the performance of that one segment at year 5, 6, 7, and 8 of it.
Right.
That would be what I call a more accurate time series kind of a projection. When we actually plot same pavement type with different year under as if it's performing at the same year, you will get some radically wiggling of the data. The reason is because it's different pavement segment which have a little bit of a different workmanship and material that is put on, although it's classified as FC2, but technically it could be slightly different. So that is the reason why that introduced a range of variability into this analysis with age when you don't do a proper time series tracking of the project itself.
Right, and so if I understand it correctly, if you, the bottom zigzag that starts at 5 years and goes up and then down and then up again, that's the SMA line, right?
That's the SMA line with different SMA project compositing to give you that result for that year. Because when we look at it at 2013, some of the SMA is 5 years old, some are 6, some are 7, some are 8, but it's not the same SMA section that you track over time.
Exactly. And so, and it's the same for the other ones as well. It's the same for the other ones as well. It's a snapshot in time of different pavements.
Correct.
Okay. And actually, if we could go to image 13, registrar, I believe it's 13. It's an appendix. And I think if I've understood it correctly here, it's showing what we were just looking at in the graphic form, which it actually shows the number of the number of pavements at each age for each type of surface course. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, so, and on the HL1 example that I gave, on the far left, there's the one sample at 8 years with an average FN of 43.8.
Correct.
And then on the SMA example, which is right in the middle there's the pavements at 5, 6, 7, and 8 years. But it's two pavements at 5 years. You can see on the bottom part of the chart, one at 6 years, 2 at 7 years, 2 at 8 years. That's what's then represented graphically in what we were just looking at, right?
Correct.
Okay. And again, and so if two pavements are involved, the number in the top part of that chart, for example, 5 years out for SMA, the 43.4 FN, that's the average of those two pavements?
Correct.
Okay. And correlative for SP 12.5 at 3 years, the average FN of 57 is there's 9 pavements that's the average of.
Correct.
Okay, so the sample sizes being quite different depending on the pavement and the year, depending.
Correct. I guess 12.5 is actually quite common, and we are trying to see, can we actually try to put, first of all, the network selection is what we call a randomized selection of the segment, because we do not want to have bias in the result, but somehow we also want to see, based on the different spread of the mix type itself, did we capture something that represent roughly the ministry and likely not totally, and that's probably what will trigger the next round of testing that we will likely have to conduct to select random sample that will represent the ministry amount of different surface type that the ministry have on out there in our highway, so that it will represent better than what was done in the 2013.
And when you talk about the network testing being a randomized sample or randomized selection so as not to have bias in the results, am I correct? What you're talking about there is when you're taking requests for testing by the regions, there's a bias in there. I don't mean that negatively, but there's a bias towards pavements that have low friction because the region has identified some potential reason for requesting the testing in the first place.
Correct, because if we start to include those analyses, likely the FN number of that network itself will likely be having a lower FN number, because it is already a suspected low friction or complaint that basically some people have felt that the traffic public felt that it might be having challenge with friction, and then we only test those. So there's an expectation those results will bias toward the low side. It's the reason why at the network level testing, we decided to randomly select. We put the number of 400 series, King Highway and everything as potential candidate, and randomly select those itself, and randomly select some of the section itself out to do the testing, so that there is no conscious bias to selecting the section.
And if we could go to image 10, please. Oh, maybe 9. Sorry, it's not correct. There we go. This is titled Friction Number and Test Speed and the Friction Speed Correlation.
Correct.
Is this the equation you were talking about?
Correct. This is the equation we developed based on the test data. You know, the R squared of 0.829 is considered quite highly correlated. So because of that, we are saying if you have tested it at FN 100, I can actually, based on the result of your FN 100, then translate it back to what is it equivalent to FN 65, then look at some of the guideline of how we would look at monitoring and determination itself if the number required. So in this graph itself, if you are basically at FN 100 at 40, you go to the graph, you go down, then at FN 65 is probably at around 45.
Right. And yeah, so following the same thing, if you're at FN 100 on the y-axis at 30, it's around 35 on FN 60. Is that right? If I'm reading that correctly? Correct. Okay. And FN 25 looks to be a little over 30. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. I'm glad that my site is working. Okay, and that's based on the results from this 2013 testing.
Correct.
Okay. And on the charts, the graphs before that we were looking at that showed the year-over-year averages for pavements, were those numbers at FN 100 or FN 65 or a combination? Do you recall?
Majority of it would be FN 100.
Okay.
Because most of the highway of the ministry is posted at 100 speed, and generally that one is, if we analyze a different speed, we would have separated out because we know that we need to do a correction to basically top FN number as equivalent.
Okay, so I get that, but when they're represented, maybe if we could go back to image 13, please, Registrar. So it shows the average number, but what I'm wondering is that is for each of these, is it taking the raw number, whether it's at, and then the average, whether it's at FN 65 or FN 100, and average?
It would be FN 100. Majority of the highway that we tested are actually FN 100, posted speed of 100, because
Right.
for the safety of the staff itself, they need to test it at the posted speed.
Right, in the 400 series
If
highways,
at lower speed, it will imply they need crash truck and everything itself.
right, and for the 400 series highways, that's the posted speed.
Yeah.
Okay, so the SMA results there, for example, those are the results at, because they're only used on 400 series highways, those are all at FN 100.
Correct.
Okay, and probably the same for the SB 12.5 FC1 and FC2s.
Correct.
Okay. And are the ones at 65, what are they? Are they more likely the ones like I'm not sure, HL4? I don't know. But what
The
would
HL1 and HL4 likely mix that we no longer use, but municipality use.
I see. But you weren't testing on municipal sites at the time.
No, we are not, but we still have some remnant old highway that we may have some of the old mixed site.
Okay. But would those be the lower speed testing or no? You know?
Some of them would be probably 90.
Okay. But I thought this is the network testing though. So I thought the network testing was either done at 100 or 65.
Yeah, then the answer is that for the lower volume road will be tested at 100, and because we are using it to calibrate it back to 65. Ultimately, like continuing on with the program itself, some of the highway we are testing it now at 90 or 80, depending on what the posted speed, and also testing at 65 to come up with a different correlation for those arterial and local highway.
Right. No, I get that. But in terms of the network testing, I appreciate
the initial one tested at 100 kilometer or 65, because that's the intent of trying to find a correlation between 100 and 65.
Absolutely, I get that. I'm just wondering which ones were at 65. You said most of them were.
Offhand, I can't tell you, but Frank was instructed to test as many as possible so that we can get statistically significant number. If you look at the plot of the FN 65 versus 100, they likely is probably more than 100 something section that have done testing of both speed.
Sorry, at which speed? At both?
Both speed, because in order for us to plot it on the 6,500 kilometer graph, you have to test it at both speed in order for it to be represented.
Yeah, at both speeds, yes. Understood. Okay. And then just if we go to image 11. Preliminary findings. I think you've largely discussed these already, but unsurprisingly higher friction values achieved for tests at 65 kilometers per hour compared to 100 kilometers per hour. But but the top bullet, data suggests that friction remains fairly constant or decreases very minimally over time. What's that based on? In what we looked at the chart, and you described the limitations in the data.
Yeah.
But
overall indication, and based on our previous experience with FN number of a lot of those DSM aggregate, it is consistent with the decrease of friction occurs initially, but tends to stabilize after three or so itself. That is quite a common phenomenon, and some of the data in this on the graph itself also indicate, relatively same kind of a trend.
Okay. And then, as we said at the outset of looking at this, that the ultimate main purpose of the network testing was in relation to the issue of performance contracts, and we know, and we'll get to this, that ultimately the MTO decided not to jettison the front-ended DSM approach in favor of entirely going to performance-based contracts. But where did you yourself eventually come down on this issue about performance contracts?
I'm actually in favor of DSM, because from my perspective itself, DSM tests the initial property of the aggregate performance doing a series of lab testing in the polystone value. After that itself, in order for you to collect for DSM, you actually have to place a real test segment with real mixed design onto a 500-meter segment of a roadway or highway itself. And we tested that over time to ensure that the performance is there for long-term duration. The real shortfall of the friction number at the specification end of the FN number is that if today I test the FN number is at 30, next year if I test it as 24, then you have basically specified a specification that works for 1 year rather than the whole duration of the design of the pavement itself. And that is one of the discussion I had with our task group itself, is that how to properly set a friction number so that as a designer, I actually expect the performance of the friction number to be as good up to the end of my design life of the pavement, not 3 years due to the warranty specification, or 7 years. At 7 years, it's already reached the end of the life of the friction number, implies I need to rehab that pavement at year 7, which means although I designed the pavement for 20 years, but the life cycle of the pavement is only 7 years or 3 years, because if you have to construct a pavement with very high friction or not, chances are if you specify a very low friction number, you are going to get a contract that is slightly above that and not much more higher than that, because that implies there's a cost implication to having to provide better material. So in that sense, I think that is still not totally set in quite a lot of agencies that look at performance-based specification, how to specify a number that is acceptable at construction, but also acceptable to ensure that there is a significant performance during the whole design life of the pavement itself. So that is still, I think the verdict is still out on that in the industry and agency.
Okay.
So in lieu of that, I think the DSM actually provide quite good assurance of after immediate construction, having the performance and also long-term performance, because the real material is actually monitored over time, and you would not put it on your DSM if you find that the material is not suitable in terms of performance, with a short and long-term performance being taken care of.
And if we could go to overview document 4, registrar, image 186. And in paragraph 446, it's referring to November 14th. Yeah, thank you. You can expand that. 2014 presentation with some recommendations at the time, which are still pertaining to if you're going to have performance specifications. And your recommendations there are based on the conversion to FN65. And then there's a recommendation as to the expected friction number. And is this, am I correct that this is again aimed at the performance specifications if you're going to put in the numbers in a contract?
Well, this is because we were directed to look at friction number in performance-based specification, because I guess when actually given the request to say if there's a choice of looking at different way to look at performance, the final recommendation to the steering committee and everything itself is to actually revert back to the DSM aggregate, and ultimately that is what is being implemented at the ministry. And moving forward, now we are still in DSM aggregate mode of selecting mix itself to ensure performance in the ministry. And for concrete, we modify it whereby insoluble residue spec is actually in place to ensure long-term performance of concrete pavement specification itself. So that actually, this if you ask me to strictly use friction number, this would be our first iteration of what we think we want to put out. Likely will be pushback from the industry. We expect that they will push the number further lower. So in some sense, this is the first iteration of what number, if you ask me to put it out. If it's strictly based on FN65, this would be the recommended.
Sorry, go ahead. I'll catch you. This would be the
because ultimately we know that the industry is used to seeing FN30 at posted speed at the ministry contract. But if they start to look at the graph of the FN 100 versus 65, very fast they'll conclude if we want it at certain value itself, we actually FN 65 40 as acceptable will translate to a certain number at FN 100.
Right. No, I get it. And so to be clear, this is, and I understood what you said before about what your view was about sticking with the DSM, and you're saying, but we're directed to look at this. But this is, if I'm correct, this is again about the inclusion in performance contracts, right? If that's
right. Especially in performance contract, inclusion in performance contract in lieu of basically if you are asked to remove DSM requirement in the specification.
Okay. And if I could sort of interpret what you were saying was you knew there was going to be pushback, so you were sort of going in high. Is that with the recommendation? Is that the
going in at a number that we think is what is appropriate? It's so likely we'll see some pushback.
Okay. And from looking at the chart, we're just in 2014 here, late 2014, and we looked at the numbers in your presentation before about the results at FN 100 versus FN 65. And so a 40 of FN 65 at that point anyway, as I understood that chart that we discussed, would be about 35 at FN 100 based on the results that you had at that point. Is that right? Okay. And if we could go to image 186, please. Oh, we're at 186. I guess 186 and 187 in paragraph 448, which straddles the two pages. So this is on November 25th, 2014. There's a geotechnical committee meeting at which you presented on the status of performance specification. And there's a couple of redactions for privilege, so I'm not asking you to talk about legal advice or anything of that sort. And we'll get to a subsequent meeting, but there's a recommendation to continue with current friction management plan. So is that referring to sticking with the DSM?
Correct.
Okay. And then Geocom, redaction for privilege, do not recommend publishing a friction number. So that, am I understanding it correctly, then is saying that, okay, if we're not going with the performance specifications, we're going with the DSM, the recommendation from Geocom is that there's that the MTO is not going to publish a what constitutes acceptable friction number. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. If we could go to image 453. Sorry, that's paragraph 453. I apologize. Image 188. Yeah. Thank you. And just to close out the issue of the performance specifications, this is a reference to a May 13th, 2015 meeting, which with the ORBA, which you were apparently at. Do you recall this meeting?
Correct.
And then it's a very short entry there on the annotated agenda, which refers to performance specifications, skid number, Stephen Lee. It refers to a May 1st, 2015 MTO meeting. And that says MTO developed friction number to use in performance specifications. Decision is to revert back to the DSM list, item closed. So is this when this is announced, I guess, to the industry?
Correct.
Okay. That the MTO is sticking with the DSM and not moving broadly based to a performance-based friction number specification.
We are going through the performance-based specification, but there will be material requirement of the DSM list, which some people wants to get rid of material requirement and all those things itself. But we are saying for frictional performance itself, the DSM is still the better way, which means it's a material spec. You have to qualify your material through the process in order to even to be used in performance-based specification. But a lot of the other performance itself have went strictly to a performance-based, but not the friction. Friction have went back to DSM.
Sorry, yeah, that's good clarification. There are still performance contracts. It's just that typically they're not done with friction number as one of those performance requirements. Yeah.
Yeah, it's done with the material requirement of the DSM list.
Right. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I would like to move on to different area now, which is could go to image 159. There's a couple of municipal requests for testing, and paragraphs 389 and 390. This deals with a request from the region of York on July 24th, 2013. Someone emails you on behalf of Vimy Henderson at Golder, requesting a small amount of friction testing required in the region of York, as was discussed last week. And you forwarded this on to Mr. Marciello to coordinate the testing with Golder for the region of York, just regarding an intersection. Mr. Marciello replied on July 26, 2013, that normally municipal requests are considered a last priority, but that he may be able to accommodate the request. And then there's discussion about whether there was an issue with accidents, and said he believes that's why it was required. And then at paragraph 391, Next image. Mr. Marciello, he conducted the testing and emailed the results to Golder, Dr. Henderson and Ms. Kennedy from Golder on August 1st, and he reported on those numbers. So first of all, we briefly talked about municipal requests when I was asking you about the kind of requests that come in. And is Mr. Marciello correct that normally municipal requests are considered a last priority, but they can be, if they can be fit in, they would be? Is that fair?
Correct.
And then if we could go to register, it's a different overview document later in time, and mostly dealing with different issues. It's overview document 6. And it's image 61. And 62. In paragraph 156. And I'm going to go to the document itself. I just want to place it in time. October 4th, 2013. So it's a few months later. Again, it's Vimy Henderson at Golder writes to you to ask if they can discuss the City of Hamilton's request for some friction testing, and then you respond on October 7th asking for more details about the scope and the timing to see if it could be accommodated. And if we could go to Golder 4467. And image 2. And do you recall these communications?
Yes, I do recall some of this.
Okay. And so there's the October 4th email from Vimy Henderson of Golder, and she says, "Hi, Stephen, our client, the City of Hamilton, wishes to have some friction testing carried out. Are you available to discuss this the beginning of next week?" And then, as I said, you wrote back, what I already referred to on October 7th, is the bottom of it. "Dear Vimy, let us know the scope and timing to see if we can accommodate this request." And sorry, did you know Dr. Henderson at the time?
I did know of her from previous dealing with her itself when our section actually procured some noise testing that Golder completed for us through her.
Okay, so you dealt with her professionally before these
Correct.
emails? Okay. Okay, and then if we go to image 1, there's actually a sticky note over part of the text. So I think we'll go to the overview document, which quotes these 2 emails without a sticky note. So it's at overview document 6, image 70. Oh yeah, 70 and 71. Paragraph 179. So this is just the continuation of the chain we were looking at. On October 29th, 2013, Dr. Henderson and Mr. Lee exchanged further messages. And then why don't we look at those, if you could expand the top there. So this is a complete excerpt from those emails, but without the sticky note. So Ms. Henderson writes to you and gives the details on October 29th. There's a gap in the time between your last email and this one from her, that they're looking to have the testing done as soon as possible. The City of Hamilton is looking to have the testing done as soon as possible, and they would like the Red Hill Valley Parkway, RHVP, and Lincoln Alexander Parkway tested. The RHVP continues into the link. I think that means the Lincoln Alexander Parkway. There are 2 lanes in each direction. Each lane is 18 kilometers in length. They will likely also ask for a few ramps to be tested. They have a couple new crosswalks in the city that they would like tested as well. Is this something you would undertake, or should they look at hiring a firm to do this given the amount of the testing? If they are all right with just having a few random locations tested on the RHVP and link, as well as ramps, a couple of random ramps and crosswalks, would this be feasible for you to do? If you did do the testing on the RHVP and link, would you need traffic control? And then you write back on the same day, we are behind in our friction network level work and performance-based specification testing. Recommend you get quotation from ARA that has the same equipment or others that have different friction equipment. Sorry, we will not be able to accommodate this for this season. Some friction testing machines are sensitive to, it says ambient / pavement surface temperature. It's actually in the original, it's a slash, not the word slash. I think that's a dictation error. So having looked at this, do you recall if that, at the time of these emails, were you aware that the MTO had previously conducted skid testing on the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
I think at this point in time itself, likely not. And I guess based on the scope that was indicated in the email itself, and as indicated in my response, we were in very tight time frame to actually come up with the performance-based specification. In fact, right after we complete the testing itself, we were asked to terminate writing concrete pavement performance-based specification and just wrap up the asphalt performance-based specification. So at this point in time, we were under very tight time frame order from the steering committee to wrap up the work on asphalt performance-based specification. And I know to complete the work itself, we run the tests until almost onset of winter itself before we get sufficient data for us to analyze for the 2013 network testing program. So I think we are pushing it right to the limit, and Frank was incurring a lot of overtime, which start to be a concern at management that we are actually allowing staff to run overtime when a lot of the other staff are not allowed to have any overtime.
Okay, so there's a few things in there. I think that the second part of what you were talking about was Frank Marciello being engaged in the network testing, and so he was busy, and so that's the reason for the unavailability for the refusal, right? That's
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And then the first part, and my specific question was about whether you had, at that point in time, whether you were aware that Mr. Marciello had previously conducted the friction testing on the Red Hill. And I believe your answer to that was that you don't think that you did at that time. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And did you know anything about the Red Hill Valley Parkway at that point in time?
The only thing I know about is that at 2008 CTA, I actually read a document itself that was published by Ludomir about using perpetual pavement on Red Hill Valley of SMA, because I'm also on the SMA task group. That's actually perked my interest in the use of SMA on Red Hill Valley Parkway. But it was strictly the use as a perpetual pavement itself.
Right. So you were on the SMA task group at some point. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. And in that context, you had an interest in SMA and you had read that paper?
Correct.
Okay. It was before you were working at the MTO, so I'm assuming at that point that the 2008 paper you're talking about. So it's not that you went to the CTAA conference. You just, I assume.
Correct.
Right. You just read it as part of your inquiries in relation to SMA. And there were, okay. So you were aware that it had an SMA surface course and a perpetual pavement, but you say that's the what was in that article or that paper was the extent of your knowledge of it at that point?
Correct.
Okay. And in terms of whether you were aware of the prior testing on the Red Hill by Mr. Marciello at the point of this email exchange, and you say you don't think you did.
I don't think I did at this point in time. Probably at the later part when I think an email was forwarded to me from Frank when they sent it to Bob and to Steve Senior. Likely it's the first time I see it as a DSM aggregate testing.
Okay, so you're talking, and we'll get to that in a moment, you're talking about when the results from Mr. Marciello's testing in July 2014, when he sent those results to you and the soils and aggregates people, you think that that's the first time that you were aware of the prior testing?
Of the testing for DSM.
Right. Well, okay. Of the testing for the DSM, yes, but for any purpose. I'm just asking if you were aware. Yeah. Is that the first time you were aware of the testing being done on the Red Hill by Mr. Marciello for any purpose?
Correct.
Okay. And from your answer, when you say, I just want to be clear on your level of certainty, you believe that's the case, but are you certain or that about the timing of that, or is that you believe most likely that's the context?
That is the most likely.
Okay. All right. Now, do you know if and when you discussed with Mr. Marciello the request from Dr. Henderson of Golder to test the Red Hill Valley Parkway and the Lincoln Alexander Parkway?
I don't think I discussed with him because at that point in time, I really knew that we are much behind in our friction testing for the performance-based specification. So in that sense, I would have made that decision without consulting him at all, given that ultimately it will impact delivery of the result for us to make the performance-based specification presentation and move forward with the specification itself.
Okay, so you don't believe that you spoke to him prior to making the decision and sending this email on October 29th?
Yeah, I'm quite certain I would not have consulted him. Okay.
And what about subsequently? Did you discuss the request with him after making the decision and communicating it to Golder?
I don't recall that we have further conversation on this after we have rejected it.
Okay, you don't recall one way or the other?
Correct.
And I can tell you that Mr. Marciello testified on Tuesday, and he did recall that he had a conversation with you about Golder's request. And he remembers, he said he remembers that you telling him that there was no time for the work because of the network testing. And he wasn't able to recall when it happened, except he did think it was at some point after your communications with Golder on this.
It would likely have to be sometime after, because I know in making the decision, I really knew that we are behind. So I would not commit to any additional testing for anyone,
okay,
given that we cannot even meet our own target.
Okay. And I understand your explanation about why you declined to conduct the testing here. Of course, we've seen that in back in July, I think it was, of 2013, you did authorize Mr. Marciello to conduct the testing in York region. Do you recall why the different approach?
At that point in time, when I probably did consult with Marciello about his progress of the friction testing, and if he have a lull in between, then basically we would accommodate if we can. Municipal request is basically one of the last few items that we would consider in our priority. If we can accommodate, we will. But if there's any ministry work that requires testing, regional testing, and everything will trump municipal requests. And basically, because we have a very tight frame for performance-based specification testing, that for 2013, his number one target to perform is to get me sufficient information in order for us to develop performance-based specification. So in that sense, his priority is to do network level testing so that we get sufficient data to actually develop the performance-based specification, where we were actually tasked to complete. It's under basically the ministry AG report, the outcome out of the AG report itself.
Okay. Okay, if we could go back to overview document 4 and image 96. And in paragraphs 229 and 230, this is the testing in 2014 on the Red Hill that we were discussing. And if you could expand 229 and 230. So the testing takes place on July 12th and 23rd, 2014, and then on July 25th, Mr. Marciello emails Stephen Sr., copying Bob Gorman and you, attaching the Red Hill friction results. And then he wrote what's in his email below, which is indicates 4 lanes of the Parkway were tested a few days ago. Performance shows friction levels continuing to drop. Quick summary of average values in 2008 and in 2014. And then he shows the comparison by lane, each of the 4 lanes in the average values in 2008 and in 2014. Excuse me. And at this point, before we get into the specifics of that, I understand that it was the typical approach in your role as pavements and foundations that if it was a request, it was test results resulting from a request from the soils and aggregates section, that his normal practice would be to email it to the soils and aggregates people and as well to the head of pavements and foundations who he reported to you, which at this point was you. Is that a fair characterization of the
Correct.
The usual approach? Yeah. And so when you receive these and you see who's on there, do you understand at that point what the purpose of the testing was, that it was for DSM purposes?
Yes, I understood that this was for DSM purposes. So in DSM purposes itself, then the result, basically decision and everything will be made by the soil and aggregate section itself. The head of soil and aggregate generally will be the contact point and key point to actually disseminate any information and make the decision whether the aggregate should remain on the DSM or qualify as a DSM aggregate itself.
Right. So if the testing's in the first 2 years, typically we've heard that then it's about whether the aggregate can be included on the DSM, and after that it's subsequent monitoring.
Correct.
About continuation on the DSM. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And Mr. Marciello provides a comparison of the 2008 and 2014 numbers. Do you recall if he was requested to do that, or if he just did that? Do you have any recollection of that?
I think generally for DSM, he may have actually just do it itself, because a lot of time for DSM, they want to look at, is there a long-term trend of the friction number?
Did you request it? When I put it that way.
I did not request it, but I think it's something that he have done. And subsequent to this, I have seen him actually provide some similar thing for different DSM site itself, where he put the multi-year friction number and, you know, in a column so that we can see the trend, if there's any.
All right. And at the time, do you recall if you reviewed the attachments and reviewed the detailed test data? In addition,
because the moment it's DSM, I would take a very cursory look itself. I would not really look at it in depth, because as indicated, for DSM aggregate qualification, the soil and aggregate, head of soil and aggregate is actually responsible for the file. Whereas if it is a regional geotech request, then pavement section, I will be responsible for the file. So given that I'm actually not responsible for the file, if there's some input, we would likely just provide the input to the head of soil and aggregate, and it's up to the head of soil and aggregate to make further decision as required, given that he is actually in charge of the DSM aggregate and correspondence to stakeholders.
Okay, so I understand that from as a general practice. What I'm then wondering is whether in this instance, you recall having at the time a look at the attachments with the detailed results.
As I said, I did a cursory look at the result itself and some of the comment that is made by Frank itself when he sent to the soil and aggregate section.
Okay. And before we go into the specific results, I want to ask you, see if we can clarify an issue that's arisen, which is, actually, why don't we just go to MTO 22943, and if we could use the native file, 22943. And if we could look at the detail tab. And this is for the northbound lane 1. Sounds like a DJ dragging the needle across a record. There's in these results for all 4 of the lanes, there's 2 columns. The second and the third columns from the left are GPS coordinates, latitude and longitude. And for prior years, and I appreciate you weren't in the position as head of pavements when the prior year testing was done, but they do not include GPS readings. And,
correct.
Okay. And so can you illuminate us on that?
Because we actually, after the network testing and everything, I actually want a much more better referencing of the location where we have done tests, and that's the reason why we initiate procuring the GPS unit for the friction trailer in April of 2014.
Okay. Okay, so just a few months prior to this testing. And I guess if you got it in April, so was that done prior to the season of testing for 2014?
Yes, it is, because we actually commission it as we send the friction trailer to US itself to do the yearly calibration. And part of the yearly calibration, we want the equipment upgrade to include the GPS.
I see. And is that Dynatest?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Because Mr. Marciello testified that he thought the GPS was installed when it was sent to Michigan. Is that where, for calibration, is that where they're located?
I think they moved from Michigan to Atlanta
Okay.
around that time itself.
Okay, but in any event, he also talked about he didn't know though when that, if that occurred, or where that occurred in relation to there being a replacement of the trailer itself. So can you tell us about when the MTO purchased and then replaced its prior skid trailer?
I think the new replacement comes in 2019 itself or so. Whereas this old one, we maintained it for a while and did the GPS upgrade in 2014.
Okay. And when was the skid trailer that was in use in 2014 on which the GPS was affixed? When was that one purchased? Have you been able to determine that?
I think that is way before my time, around 2003, if I'm not wrong.
Okay. Have you made inquiries to satisfy yourself about that?
I tried to find out, but it has been quite a while, so I'm still trying to get a definitive answer on when that one was procured.
Okay, but are you confident that it was in the early 2000s, if not the exact date?
Likely in early 2000, based on some of the correspondence that basically my staff have been able to dug out.
Okay. And what about, is it before 2007?
I think it's before 2007.
Okay. Okay, Commissioner, it is just before 11:30, which is our typical time for a break. And before I get into the specific 2014 results, this might be a good time.
That's fine. Let's return at 11:45. We'll stand adjourned until that time.
Register.
I was going to ask, you'll have the registrar put counsel in a separate breakout room?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We're back from break. May I proceed, Commissioner?
Please do.
Okay, so Mr. Lee, coming back then to the actual results, and Registrar, if we could pull up again image 96. And while it's doing that, we can absolutely look at the specific, at the results like we were just before the break. We can do that too. And I may take you to it, but if any time that's what you want to look at, we can do that. We can pull up to 2 at a time to have on the screen. Okay, so you received these results and you described the context in which you received them. And do you recall what your view was of these results at the time?
I guess when I look at the result itself, it is dropping to near to level that we would definitely look at continuous monitoring of the result if it is actually a regional project. And for DSM, then it's up to the soil and aggregate section to see what monitoring or action that they require further from this. But internal discussion, if you ever have one, would be you need to continue to monitor the DSM aggregate.
Okay. So a couple of things there. The first thing is before discussions, I just want to talk about your views. And if I got you correctly, that if it was a regional request, if the reason for the skid testing in the first place was because a region had requested it, that because the results are dropping, you said dropping to a level that you would definitely look at continuous monitoring if it was a request. Now, the average results are still a little bit above 30. So,
correct.
Right. So, are you saying that you wouldn't necessarily, and you correct me if I'm wrong, are you saying that if that was the case, your recommendation would be, look, we should continue to friction test this, but not necessarily get into a further investigation? Is that what you're saying?
Definitely monitored to see how the trend of the friction number goes itself. And if it still drops further, then definitely we will look at additional factors above and beyond just friction number alone.
Right. So if it continued to drop, if I understand you correctly, then you would get into the different assessments that you described earlier.
Correct.
Okay. And then you also then referred to discussions, internal discussions, I think you said. Do you recall if you did have internal discussions about these results?
No, I don't think we did. It was sent to the soil and aggregate section, and then basically, from what I understood, is they were the one that make the decision. And the last I heard of it is that the D-mix aggregate was dropped from the DSM because they did not pay the fee to the ministry for being on DSM.
Okay, so that's much later. We know that's in 2016. But at this point, you're saying you don't recall any conversations? You didn't even talk to Mr. Marciello about it?
No, I don't recall talking to Marciello. The only one time that I might have, Becca may have approached me to maybe have a conversation with Steve Sr., but then before we have that meeting itself, he retired, so that basically meeting did not take place.
Sorry, you said may have. Do you have do you have a recollection?
No,
that
we did not have the meeting because he retired and we did not have that meeting. I know at one point, I think Becca was trying to initiate a meeting between pavement section and soil and aggregate section, but that meeting did not take place.
Okay, about demix aggregates specifically?
Yeah, about D-mix aggregate.
Okay, so, I mean, I can tell you that Ms. Lane had testified that that after that at some point after these results came in, and she wasn't copied on this email, of course, that Mr. Marciello with Mr. Gorman came to visit her in her office, and they wanted to talk about demix aggregates and these results, and they showed her the results. And then the three of them went over to Mr. Senior's office and had a further discussion about it. And that ultimately the decision was made that demix would continue on the DSM. So that's what her recollection was of there being a meeting, and that one didn't involve you.
Correct.
Are you talking about something around that period of time, around the time of these results, or I mean, if it's close to the time when Mr. Senior left, it's much later than that. It's either in 2015.
It's much later than that. It's always because I know we never had the meeting to discuss it after, and by the time we wanted to schedule something, he already announced his intention to retire, so that meeting never took place.
Okay. And what did Ms. Lane tell you about the purpose was of this meeting then?
Well,
or was this initiated by you or initiated by her? Why don't we start with that?
It's not initiated by me.
Okay. And so what did she tell you the purpose was of the meeting beyond that it was about demix aggregate?
To look at the demix aggregate itself, because ultimately it's a granitic source that we have not used. So is there any other thing that I would provide as an input into that? Although soil and aggregate is actually the custodian, sometimes the pavement group itself, if we know of certain source, given that I've worked in the Ottawa Carleton area for about 10 years, I do know of some of the Quebec source itself based on my previous work as a pavement engineer in Ottawa Carleton. Probably why she asked me to have a conversation with Steve Senior on the demix aggregate itself. This is just a general comment on basically just to have a conversation, but that conversation never happened.
Okay, so I understand that it never happened. Was the conversation though about whether whether to continue demix aggregates on the DSM?
It's basically to see if granitic aggregate of that type itself is suitable for use in SMA, because granite in Ottawa Carleton area have been used in a few instances in SMA, and I have used it as part of Ottawa Carleton. So it's very depending on a lot of the test result and everything itself. Would you still consider using a granitic source for SMA? Because ultimately there are only very few sources of aggregate that can be used for SMA. So the more source you have, likely it's better for the ministry.
Okay, and so when you say granitic, you mean granite, a type of granite?
Correct. It's actually the composition, the mineralogy of the aggregate as well as the granitic nature. So I think in her context itself, it probably may or may not be related to friction, or could be just strictly, can we have another source that can be used for SMA, is why the conversation she wanted me to have with Steve Senior.
Okay, and another source being what? Do you mean demix aggregates or?
As a asphalt aggregate itself for SMA.
Yes, but do you mean demix aggregates, or are you talking about, because that's not a granite, right?
The demix aggregate, from what I understood, is granitic in nature. So in that sense, granitic aggregate have a certain property that works for it and also work against it. And do I know enough of that itself? At that point in time, I don't.
Okay, I'm not a geologist. It was classified broadly speaking as a trap rock. Is that a granite?
Trap rock is a different kind of a rock itself. So that is the conversation I actually need to have with Steve Senior, because technically they are the more expert in the geological side of thing itself. For me, I'm probably more familiar with the physical performance of the aggregate given my previous background.
Right. Okay, and that's fair enough. So really what I just want to understand is the purpose of going to talk to Mr. Senior that Ms. Lane asked you to do that, because at that point we don't have any further friction test results. The last friction test results done by the MTO on the Red Hill Valley Parkway were, and the only ones that the DMIX aggregate were used for was in the Red Hill Valley Parkway in Ontario. And so what prompted this discussion?
As I indicated, likely to see, is it still a source that should be considered based on other physical property? Because ultimately, if the friction is one of the decisions that you make based on the FN number itself, and that is the conversation we need to have with the head of soil and aggregate, because ultimately they are the one that will make the decision to actually put them on the list or remove from the list based on a slew of different properties that we look at.
Right. Okay. And do you recall, did you ever have any direct communications with DMIX aggregates?
No, I didn't.
No? Okay. Okay, and then coming back to your views of the results from July 2014, if I understood you correctly, that you were that you had a concern that the friction number was continuing to drop over time rather than stabilizing. Is that the first thing that you noted from the results?
I would say that, notice the trend that is dropping, but it's to a point whereby we would look at further monitoring.
Right. Okay. And is that, and I guess that's the question, does that communicated in any way to?
The expectation is that because this is a DSM aggregate itself, the head of soil and aggregate would make that call. And that is normally the case. If there's a requirement to further monitor, they would actually instruct our section in the following year to go ahead and collect the friction testing. And that has been the normal practice.
Okay. And what was your experience with DSM aggregates? Were these results ones that were at the low end of DSM aggregates?
I can't say for sure. It's because when I look at DSM aggregate, as I indicated earlier itself, I would do a very cursory look, given that I know the decision and the direction will be provided by the head of soil and aggregate. So in that sense, unless something very drastic itself, I would literally basically leave it to the head of soil and aggregate to make the decision.
No, I get that. I'm just wondering about your view. You've been very clear about the division of responsibilities, and I understand.
This is basically, I would say, if I look at it, then basically I would look at it as further monitoring if you want to maintain it on the DSM list.
Okay, thank you. And if this was, just to make sure we close the circle and we understand the distinction, if this had been a request by the regions, a region, am I correct from your answers that you then would have recommended to them that it be continued, that there be continued skid testing in the future to monitor it for a further drop? Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And if we could look at Registrar, if you could pull up MTO. Sorry, MTO 22944 and 22946, please. In the native format, please. There we are. Okay, if we could go to the chart form on both of them, please. So the one on the left is northbound lane 2, and the one on the right is southbound lane 2. And it has the historical record there. And did you appreciate, if you recall, if you appreciated at the time that the testing went back to 2007 in the cases of the southbound lanes?
Well, I think I saw the 2004 comparison to probably the email that was sent to me by Frank itself, compared 2 years itself, but I was not really aware that, you know, they have so many years of history of testing on the Red Hill Valley Parkway.
Okay. I mean, his email did the comparison between 2008 and 2014, but we know that there were the 2007 tests on the southbound lanes as well. And I'm just wondering if at the time you appreciated that or no?
No, the reason is because I think I joined the section way after some of this initial testing have already occurred. And as I say, the first instance of the Red Hill Valley result being copied on is, I think, is the 2014 result is when the first time I'm officially copied in on the result.
Right. No, I get that. Well, you say officially. Does that mean that you were aware of the testing prior to that?
Not really, because if I do not assume the position of head of pavement and foundation, I would not get any of this correspondence from Frank.
I get that. And you weren't copied on any of that correspondence from prior years. The first time you were copied on any of it was in 2014. Just the words
Right.
It's a word you just said, well, not really. And so I'm wondering if you were aware of the prior testing.
No, I'm not.
Or 2014.
I'm not.
Okay, all right. You were not. Now you are. You weren't then. Is that fair?
Yeah, now I'm aware, but I'm not aware that back then.
Okay. All right. And if we could look at the detailed results. We already looked at these for one of them, and as we indicated, it shows the GPS results. And do you recall if you you already said that I think you said that you had a cursory look at them. You did look at the attachments, but it was a cursory look. Do you recall if you were looking so closely as to see the individual test results?
No, I'm probably, when I do a cursory review, I would review the average number.
Okay, so the one at the bottom there in the
30.7
and 30.5 in this instance?
Correct.
Okay, would you look at the minimum and the maximum and the standard deviation?
I would look at the standard deviation to see how far it is from the mean, and then that basically gives me a rough idea is the mean and max reasonable.
Okay. And your conclusion was?
It looks reasonable. The average number looks reasonable. Because sometimes I just look at is the mean and max roughly 1.5 standard deviation away from the average value.
All right. And so in that is you're indicating that you wouldn't have been looking at the individual results that were below 30 in this instance. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And would you have spent as much time reviewing it as we have just spent?
No, likely not, because I would just cursory glance at the number, and back in 2014, if that's the time frame itself, the way that we would analyze and look at the result would be based on average result, given that's the standard that we have actually looked at how to interpret ASTM standard. And then basically, as I said, I would do a very fast look at the mean and standard deviation, this mean and standard deviation. If your mean and max result are not too far from 1.5 standard deviation away, that tells me your result is roughly normally distributed. Then I'm saying the result should be applicable, and look at make your decision based on the average FN.
Okay, thank you. And following this, did you ever inform the city of Hamilton or Golder or any other representative of the city of Hamilton about the results of the MTO's testing on the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
No, as I indicated, because this is a DSM initiative of testing, the only portal of communication would be through the soil and aggregate section itself. Right. I would not contact any of the stakeholder, because ultimately that responsibility lies with the soil and aggregate section.
Right. You would have had the authority to do so, though, correct?
I would have the authority to discuss it with the head of soil and aggregate itself, but then ultimately as a protocol, similarly, if it is a regional request of the friction testing to the pavement section, even if soil and aggregate is aware of the testing, the communication to the region have to come to the pavement section. A similar reciprocal protocol is like if it is a DSM aggregate testing, communication, the line of communication is through soil and aggregate section.
Okay, so first of all, by a protocol, I take it you're not talking about a written protocol, you're talking about a practice or an understanding?
Well, that is basically our role and responsibility in terms of when you are the head of soil and aggregate, designated source aggregate qualification strictly is your responsibility. Whereas with the regional GeoTech as chairing the GeoCom, the liaison and actual implementation of standard specification and policy with the regional GeoTech reside with the head of pavement. So that is quite a clear definition of our role and responsibility.
Sorry, I understand the difference, but there's nothing spelling out to say that you can or cannot disclose results from testing requested of your section by soils and aggregates. There's nothing in writing or a directive or anything else that says that you can't disclose this to a third party. Is that fair?
Well, I think it's a protocol that has been established way before my time, whereby it's DSM, all the result goes to the soil and aggregate section, and decision will be made by the soil and aggregate section. That basically is the direction that I understood how DSM is administered in the ministry.
Right. No, that's the DSM though. I'm just talking about communicating with the city of
But
Hamilton.
this is actually result. If you tell me this is a DSM testing, then it is actually the DSM protocol that I have to follow.
Okay.
Had this been not a DSM testing of the aggregate, then we would have followed other protocol. of reporting and providing technical assistance.
All right. You were contacted by Vimy Henderson of Golder in October 2013, so just the prior year, about whether the MTO could conduct skid testing for Hamilton, and you declined to do so on the basis that Mr. Marciello was too busy, the network testing was going on at the time,
Right.
and you suggested that she might go to another party for testing. Did it
Correct.
occur to you at this point in 2014 that Ms. Henderson had made the request earlier? Is that something that crossed your mind at this point?
Well, I do not know that basically it is related to the same issue itself, because as I say, if I've come through her as part of the municipal request, the protocol, then I would have had we done the testing and I think I would have interact with her like it's not a DSM request. But if I have known that then thereafter there is a DSM request, then it would be handled through the protocol of actually the soil and aggregate section.
Okay, I understand what you said about the protocol. What I'm asking is,
I'm not aware that it's actually tied to previous testing before.
I'm not asking you whether it's tied to it. I'm asking whether it occurred to you at this point that when you get these results and you have the thoughts that you had about it, did you think about Ms. Henderson having made the request for skid testing in the prior year?
No, it didn't cross my mind.
Okay. And the just coming back to the protocol that you talked about. You described a bunch of things. There was a lot of things that you said there. Just want to be clear that there is nothing that said that you could not disclose the results to the city of Hamilton or Golder had you chosen to do so. Is that fair?
Mr. Commissioner, I think Mr. Lee has answered this question to the best of his abilities. He's made it clear that.
That's fine, Mr. Saad. I think, Mr. Lewis, it's clear that there was no written protocol, but that there was an understanding which Mr. Lee had with respect to how to handle requests.
Right, then I'd like to ask him about what Ms. Lane did in 2010.
Well, that's fine. You can go on. I think you're just asking the same question.
Okay.
And here, and Mr. Saad is correct that it's been answered.
Thank you. So I think you indicated that this protocol was from prior, before your involvement and before you were in this position. We did hear from Ms. Lane that in 2010, after Mr. Marciello conducted the testing in that year, it raised some concerns for her, but Mr. Marciello provided her with the results in November 2010, and she contacted Dr. Zarowski of Golder about it. And as she was your one removed predecessor in that context, and she was also dealing with skid test results that were conducted for the purposes of the DSM at the request of Soils and Aggregates, she nonetheless took it upon herself to contact Golder. So I'm wondering where this unwritten protocol came from in your recollection.
Well, I guess it's when I took the position itself, they are basically briefing of what is my role and responsibility. And I guess that's basically when we discuss about DSM with the head of soil and aggregate and everything. They point blank say that they are the custodian of the DSM, and that's the flow of information expectation from us, although we basically then perform the testing function for soil and aggregate section. So there is an understanding between the pavement group and the soil and aggregate, because the head of soil and aggregate sometimes also attend GeoCom, whereby we actually perform the technical assistant role to the regional geotech, and soil and aggregate will be not involved, or they can provide input, but ultimately how to direct the regional geotech reside with the head of pavement section itself. So in that sense, after a few of those events, unofficially we have established a protocol of how basically some of these things are communicated between the two sections.
Okay. We know that in 2010, and those are the results I was just talking about with respect to Ms. Lane and her communication with Golder, that in 2010, Mr. Marciello tested the Red Hill Valley Parkway at around 100 kilometers an hour rather than the posted speed of 90, and as he had done in every other year. And that in 2011, he corrected the 2010 results in the historical tracking charts that you were reviewing in 2014. Do you recall discussing that issue with him at any point, that there had been a test speed discrepancy at some point?
I think we had a discussion, but it likely is much later than that itself, is because I think the way that the speed correction was done was by a rule of thumb of reducing the point by 2 points for whatever speed it is. Whereas my recollection is that I'm saying if you want to do a speed reduction computation, you actually need to test it at two different speeds and come up with the curve that we have now come up with to do the correction, because if not, it is a rule of thumb only rule.
Okay, and you said you think it would be at a much later point in time. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously it wasn't 2010 because you weren't in the position then. So
correct.
What are you talking about?
It will be much later, but I can't tell you the exact date.
Okay. Certainly after you became the head of pavements and foundations, I assume.
Likely, yeah.
Okay. And would it have been at the time of the 2014 results, the discussion, when you reviewed the?
It likely is after that, because without the 2014, I would not be able to see the differences itself.
Right.
Because I think the first time I look at the result from Red Hill Valley is after the 2014 result, and probably you have mentioned, I guess in terms of speed, that is one of the things that I know for a fact, because you test at different speed, you will get different number for the same pavement itself. Is why we actually expand the program to do tests at different speeds so that we can make that jump from inferring result that we have done before at 100 or posted speed itself back to FN 65.
Right, but so that though suggests that you did have a conversation with Mr. Marciello about the 2014 results. And
after the fact, way after the fact itself, if you notice any anomaly and how you adjust it, I may not agree with how he adjusts it by just using a rule of thumb. I would say we will need to look at what is the result we come up with after the network testing and then do the adjustment accordingly, even if you have to revise it again.
Right, but there's nothing in these results here that show the test speed anomaly in 2010. So it could come up by way of a discussion. So I'm wondering if it was in the context of the discussion about these results and the trajectory that you discussed over time.
I guess the only thing that I remember recalling that the conversation with him is that I did ask, what is the test speed of some of the tests itself, and I guess he indicated some of it was at 90, some is at 100, and I'm saying if you test it at 90 as 100, there likely will be a difference in the answer, strictly not because of the testing, it's because the speed you tested have an impact on the FN value. And he actually, I do recall that he told me that there's a rule of thumb how he would correct those results itself, and I said I may or may not agree with that.
But was there any other time you would be talking to him about it other than when you got the 2014 results from him? I mean,
Mr. Commissioner, I think Mr.
I'm
Lee
going to
has.
allow the last question, Mr. Saad, because it is a little different. And I understand what he's going for, but Mr. Lewis, I think this will be the last question on this topic.
Thank you.
Yeah, it likely will be a time when he has shown me some of the result and likely the 2014 result. After the 2014 result, because without that, there is no basis for us to have the discussion.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay, if we could go registrar to overview document 8 and image 27. And it's 27 and 28, paragraph 64. Yeah. And so this is on December 11th, 2017, jumping ahead a few years now. Dr. Uzorowski from Golder emailed you and the top of page 28, if you could just expand that for us, please, registrar. He asked you, do you know who at MTO can do polished known value, PSV test? And if could you please send me the contact information? I have to do it for one of the large municipalities here. Typically, we would send the samples to Ireland or the UK, but due to urgency, I wonder if this can be done by MTO. And if you could take that down, please. And then you replied in the next paragraph, 65, and you gave him contact information for Joel Manyan, who was the head of soils and aggregates at that point, Mr. Senior having departed the MTO.
Right.
Right. And then, do you recall these communications?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And then in paragraph 66, you'll see Mr. Manyan, who you had copied, replied the same day, and he copied you, advising Dr. Uzorowski that the MTO couldn't perform the testing, noting that it performs it for the PSV testing for the purposes of maintaining the DSM list, and doesn't have the resources for third-party requests. And he suggested AMAC and as well some other options in his email. And then finally, I guess if you could move up the next image as well, so it's 28 and 29. He replied, thanks for the clarification to Joel, and that they've done the testing in the UK and Ireland in the past. And then finally on at the top of the next page, he replied, and he didn't copy you on this one. Mr. Mannion replies and saying, okay, but we confirmed this year that there is a lab in Hamilton that does the test, so that is another option, AMAC. Excuse me. Were you aware that this request pertained to the city of Hamilton at the time?
No, I didn't, because it was requested to do PSN. I just basically, because he wants a contact for that testing, and the right person to contact is Joel Magna. So I provide him with the contact and he can follow up on it. So
Right.
that was the end of my involvement with Ludomir on this issue.
That's because Soils and Aggregates does the PSV testing.
Correct.
And sorry, I said about this, I asked if you were aware about the city of Hamilton. Would it be correct? You were also not aware that it was in relation to the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
No, I did not realize that it was tied to Red Hill Valley.
The last thing I'd like to take you to is we discussed earlier that in 2014, the MTO had the GPS device included on the skid trailer, right?
Correct.
Okay. And we know that after the whole story broke publicly, which led ultimately to the calling of this inquiry in 2019, February 2019, Kevin Bentley of the ministry of the MTO sent an email to Ed Soldo of the city of Hamilton, and he attached a spreadsheet with Red Hill Valley Parkway skid test data from 2008 to 2014. And at this point, the story had broken, and the city and the MTO were in communications about what had happened. And Ms. Lane had testified that she got involved because the initial question was about whether the MTO had done Red Hill Valley Parkway skid testing. And she testified that she first spoke to you and asked about it, and you had and asked if skid testing had been done, and you at first said no, there hadn't been any testing. Do you recall that conversation?
Not really.
Okay. And in any event, she then testified that she was getting information about what had occurred and from MTO staff, and that included getting the test data.
Correct.
Right. And do you recall, was it you that gave her the spreadsheet with test data? I'll take you to the spreadsheet, but
Yeah, I need to see the spreadsheet itself.
Yeah.
Is like the one that we provided.
Okay. So if we could pull up two documents. One is HAM 54585. And that's not a spreadsheet, that's just an email, so we don't need the native for that. And the second is HAM 54586. And I like that in the native format, please.
Sorry, Council, did you want them side by side or one at a time?
Let's pull up the email first, I guess.
Okay, just because I can't put on queue
name.
and an Excel sheet side by side.
Okay. All right. So if we put up the email first, please.
Okay.
So you see at the bottom of this email on February 12th, this chain, Edward Soldo asked Kevin Bentley, copy to Ms. Lane. Thank you for providing the graphs. Can you provide the underlying data that developed them? As well as further information. And then on February 13th, you'll see Mr. Bentley emailed to Mr. Soldo, copied Ms. Lane, as requested, attached is the underlying data. Also attached is the mixed design. And then it just gets forwarded on within the city. And then so so this is just to give you the date and the context. And then the other document, please, Registrar, HAM 54586 in native. So there's a number of tabs to this. but it on the first tab, project summary, it contains the dates from 2008 through 2014, of course, with the exception of 2013. And then on the rest of the tabs, it's the same. Do you want to have a look at them?
Yeah, this table, I'm actually not familiar with it, and I don't think I have seen it before until now, to be frank, because I have not summarized my section. If they have summarized this thing, it's actually summarized without my knowledge.
Okay, well, that's, I don't know if it's a summary.
If it's all SMA, and if it is SMA and format summarized in this way, I would have known, but I don't recollect ever seeing a table like this.
Okay, just look at the test data.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, move up again. It's the it's all done by year, starting back in 2008 at the top.
Yeah, I'm not sure who summarized this data itself.
Okay.
The source likely is from Pavement and Foundation, from some hard drive somewhere, but the way that this is formatted and reported, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, it just because Mr. Marciello, the reason I ask is Mr. Marciello had pointed out it's in a different format than he produced his skid test reports, of course, as we've seen. And so he did not know how it was generated. And I, from your evidence, you also are not sure about that. You don't know that. Can it all just be downloaded from the skid trailer, from the software, do you know?
Yes, this the data can be downloaded, and then you can summarize the data combination of the data in different format. So as I said, this is the first time I see it in this format.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I don't have any further questions. Commissioner, thank you, Mr. Lee.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, Council, for the participants, had indicated before they all asked to reserve some time, but I don't know if anyone has any questions. So perhaps we could start with Council for the city.
Before we go there, may I just raise a point? And Commissioner, I just want to address a piece of actual question asked by Mr. Lewis earlier, in which he was talking about the Becca Lane, her email of November 15, 2010. And Mr. Lewis, I think you said that after Frank conducted the testing, it raised a concern in November of 2010, and then Becca Lane contacted Dr. Uzarowski about it. The evidence was that Becca Lane contacted Ludmila Uzarowski for a contact for Hamilton, not to talk about that test, that testing.
Yeah, I understand that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
So perhaps we could start with Mr. Chen, or Council could advise how long they would like if they have any questions.
I have no questions, Mr. Lewis.
Okay.
And Ms. Roberts?
Thank you. I have no questions either.
Mr. Buck?
I have no questions.
Okay.
And Ms. McIver?
I do have a brief follow-up question, yes?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Registrar, if you could please pull up overview document 6, image 71. Or I'm sorry, it must be overview document 4, image 71. Okay, and I stand corrected. It must be overview document 671. I apologize.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
Okay, and Registrar, if you could call out the top 2 paragraphs, I would appreciate it. Thank you. Hi, Mr. Lee.
Yeah. Hi, Heather.
Mr. Lewis earlier took you to this request, which is the request from Dr. Henderson of Boulder.
Yes.
And I see here that the request is for testing on the Lincoln Park, Alexander Parkway, also for testing within the municipality at crosswalks, and on the Red Hill Valley Parkway, and there's reference to each lane being 18 kilometers in length. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's quite an extensive request itself from WIMI itself on this thing, and that's the reason why when we look at it, based on what we need to do in the performance-based specification, definitely we can't accommodate it.
Okay, and so your evidence is that you knew upon reviewing this request that it was too extensive to be accommodated without further discussion with anybody in the unit?
No, in fact, I actually make that decision because we are already behind in terms of the network level testing, which we required the result to develop the performance-based specification that we are in a very tight time frame to develop. So with that itself, I actually make that decision that it cannot be accommodated given that the request is so extensive too.
Okay, I understand. And from this extensive request, did you form an understanding, or did you understand that the city had any specific concern or issue with the Red Hill Valley Parkway?
At that point in time, I'm not aware of it itself, and it has not been conveyed to me that there is an issue with Red Hill Valley Parkway.
Okay, and I see you referred them to ARA. That is an external agency that conducts testing.
It's a third-party consultant that can do the same testing, and I know for a fact they have the same ESTM Big Force Taylor as the ministry.
Okay, and was it your understanding that this resolved that issue, or were they in further contact with you about the same matter?
No, I think that basically after that itself, I assume that they have got their testing equipment that they required and do whatever testing that they required, and we did not communicate further on it after that.
Okay, thank you. And now, my last question is about that 2008 versus 2014 results that Mr. Marciello sent you. My friend asked you whether you thought the results were acceptable, and you said yes, and then you said you referred to a continued monitoring. So just to clarify, that would have been continued monitoring for inclusion on the DSM. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, because if you want to include it for DSM, the DSM don't look at just the immediate term performance of the friction number. We also continue to look at the friction performance over time in terms of several years to see what is the performance long term, and that is my personal opinion why DSM is actually superior to friction spec that basically asks for only one-time friction number, because as I indicated, if you ask for a certain threshold value of friction in year one, what happens if that number deteriorates to below your performance level you want in year three? Whereas in a DSM environment, because the aggregate and the mix itself that you place down in a trial is monitored over a number of years. So you have if I put and continue to put your aggregate on the DSM, this imply your mix itself constructed using those aggregate not only have immediate term performance, but also long-term performance. And the continued monitoring we would actually carry out on all DSM aggregate that we qualify, because that is the only way that we can have assurance that those aggregate have long-term performance.
Okay, and so by that you mean the long-term frictional characteristics of this aggregate. That's what you would continue to assess?
Correct. Because that is part and integral part of the DSM is that you actually monitoring the friction performance not only as constructed, but a number of years after it's constructed, we still keep monitoring to ensure like the performance is there, which is the difference between one-time the performance-based specification requirement versus DSM aggregate, where we actually run through the initial conditioning of the aggregate using a polystone value system. And we make you place a test 500-meter test strip somewhere where we will test over a number of years to actually ensure that the performance continue long term.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lee. My last question, Mr. Lewis asked you about to whom you disclosed these those 2014 results, and you spoke about your practice being to loop in with the soils and aggregates because that was in fact their work product. Did I get that correct?
Correct, because if it is DSM testing and spec itself, then automatically the pavement section would do the testing, but we are not the custodian of the result. Soil and aggregate is the custodian, and hence if there's any communication with stakeholder and everything, it will have to come out through the soil and aggregate section.
Okay.
That is the protocol we follow.
Okay, fair enough, and I appreciate that you didn't have concerns with the data, but is your evidence that if you did have concerns, then you would flag them for soils and aggregates?
Yeah, if I have concern, I would have, if it's a DSM aggregate, the conversation would be with the head of soil and aggregate section itself.
Okay.
But not with any external stakeholder, given ultimately the communication have to come through the soil and aggregate section.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lee. Those are my questions.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Lewis.
No further questions, Commissioner.
Okay. Do I take it we do not have a witness who's available this afternoon?
That is correct.
Okay. First of all, Mr. Lee, thank you very much for attending the inquiry this morning. You're excused.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And the rest of council, I guess we stand adjourned now until Monday morning at 9:30. Is that correct? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Have a good weekend.